Across this whole chapter, we're going to be going over some of the new features that are included in Vray 3.1 and Vray 3. First, to start out, we are going to begin with just a really quick preview of what XGen integration looks like. You may notice I'm in Maya 2016 in this video, which does have XGen and Bifrost. If you go over to your modeling subset to generate, you can see all of your XGen menu, and also if you click this button, if you don't have the XGen tab over here, you can see what's going on. So I've got some plants that are randomly kind of generated across the scene. I pulled in an image of what the comp looks like for this. It's just kind of rendered with some depth of field. The camera's kind of tucked down in there with a V-Ray sun and sky. Here's my camera. And then we've got our actual XGen set right here. So right now my collection is my test collection. My description is my grass test. And the main thing that I want to share with you is that you do need to set your renderer to V-Ray. And the operation you can just keep as render if you want, or you could also kick out a VR scene file to render with V-Ray standalone. If you want to do a batch render, you do need to say file export patches for batch render, and then you can choose to export either a single frame or a full frame range if you want to. I'm just going to export a single file, and that's it. It'll be exported, and when you do a batch render, it'll automatically grab that file for yourself. When you do any changes to this, you do want to make sure that you rerun that export patches for batch render so that it's available for V-Ray at render time. I'm not really going to get into it too far, but in Maya 2016, V-Ray does also support Bifrost, and it will also support rendering isometric surfaces that don't need to be meshed and cached out. They can just be meshed at render time, which is pretty cool. So yeah, so that's kind of a little preview of XGen. Unfortunately, I can't include the scene file in the collection of files that come with the video, but I do want you to know that there's a very extensive XGen documentation section on the Chaos Group website for further information regarding setting up anything XGen related. So the rest of this video, as I mentioned, is going to be a lot of updates specifically coming up. We're going to talk about actually a new Vray 3 feature. So just so you know, that's what's coming up in this chapter. There's going to be a bunch of small videos, and let's get to it. In this video, we're going to talk about two new features of Vray 3 that are really pretty important and actually disabled by default because they could potentially interfere with older scenes coming from Vray 2.4 or 2. Whatever. This is the first example we're going to look at here to show off a new setting in the render settings right here called in the main Vray render settings tab. Under global options, and you have to expand global options advanced, and then you'll see if you scroll down we have this clamp max ray intensity. This clamp max ray intensity actually suppresses some of the high intensity values coming from light sources like these that I have here. You can see I've got a car paint shader on these three spheres and also a reflective ground plane bouncing additional light back up, and it's creating a pretty noisy setup here. And if you look at the Vray documentation, you can see they have some other examples actually on their YouTube channel with some pretty intense noise coming from these light sources, and we've always called them fireflies, and sometimes you'll get like one little pixel of really bright light, and it just sizzles from frame to frame. So previously, and I believe I went over this in the old version of this Nomen video, you could go to subpixel mapping under color mapping advanced. You could turn on subpixel mapping and then clamp the output. But that would actually roll off all of the values in your scene so that they were coming out of the EXR with a lot of their high dynamic range float values clamped. And that was really bad. So a lot of times we would do things like, take care of the noise on the comp side or whatever. We would start doing a lot of fixes. So in comes Vray 3 with this clamp max ray intensity, and it really is pretty phenomenal because it maintains all of the high dynamic range info in your EXR, but it also does a really nice job rolling off some of those really intense little pixels. So in this example right here, you can see, if I just turn it on, and we'll just render this little box right next to it. Actually, we'll do one kind of across the bottom so you can, well, I guess we'll side by side will be better. We'll just hit render. And you can really see there's, a pretty massive difference here from the side on the right here to the side on the left. And if you lower this value even more, it's going to smooth out that result more and more. It defaults to a value of 20, actually, and you can see we'll just draw a new box kind of right in the middle here. You want to balance this value because there may be, you can see with setting this to 20, it is still smoothing out some of that noise, but it's maintaining a little bit of it. Because I'm on a car paint shader, and it is supposed to have some of that noise, you have to kind of weigh exactly how much of those bright values you want clamped. Because see, if I set this to something really low, like 2, I'll just do one more box right here, you'll get a much, much smoother result that will actually even start potentially killing some of the detail. You can see this is almost feeling, it's really knocking that specular down, so you kind of lose it completely. This is to be used, what I'll do is I try and get my sampling figured out, and I get this value figured out, and then I'll go in and start dialing my reflection subdivs, because that's also going to affect the look of this stuff. So if I kept this at 10 and I was happy with that look at 10, then I could go in on my car paint shader here, and I could go and set, well, actually I've already dialed some of these subdivs up a little. If I actually set this back down to the default value of 8, you'll see that the noise is pretty bad. And so you can see a lot of this noise I knew was because I just had my subdivs so low, so I cranked those up. And if I was still getting some noise, I could crank these even a little higher to maybe something like 32. So definitely take full advantage of this, and also do know that if you open up an old scene, this clamp max ray intensity is going to be turned off by default. So let's go over, I've got a render layer in the scene file for you here, this Vray 3 update scene file. And I've got a render layer for this other attribute called probabilistic lights. Oops, got a little override there. So this probabilistic lights is a new setting. Let's take a look at this scene here. That's able to optimize the sampling of many lights in your scene. So by default, again, this is disabled. This one you're not going to want to just turn on all the time. You really only want to turn it on if you have a setup like this where you do, in this case I have 100 V-Ray sphere lights in my scene. But with this turned off, V-Ray is going to go into each light and evaluate it separately. It's going to calculate shadows, it's going to calculate GI bounces, all of that stuff will be done on a per light basis. And with heavy scenes like this, you'll really start to notice that it can really bog down your whole setup here. If this had more geometry in it as well, like displacements and different types of reflections and shaders and materials and everything, you'd really start to feel that pain. So when you turn this probabilistic lights on, V-Ray is able to go in and randomly choose the specified number of lights right here. So it'll still go in and your look will still be very similar, but V-Ray will go in and, rather than rendering 100 lights, you can tell it to only render 12. And that, of course, will result in a much faster render time, but because it's going in and randomly evaluating some of this stuff, it does actually start leaving some noise at really low values. So the higher this number goes, by the way, it defaults to 8. The higher that number goes, the less noise there's going to be, but you're essentially introducing more lights, so your render time will go up. So let's see that in practice. So first let's turn it off, and I will do a quick render of this scene. Okay, so I'm saving these images in the history, but just so you can see, this is what the actual image looks like, and without probabilistic lights turned on, this image took 26.9 seconds to render. So let's go into our global options, and under global options advanced, so we'll expand that down. We're going to turn on this probabilistic lights, and we'll first see what the render time does set to a value of 8. So you can see our render time dropped to 22 seconds, and if I load in that other image that we had, and just kind of flip back and forth here, you can see if I zoom in on this image, there is starting to be a fair amount of noise introduced into this scene, but my render settings are a little bit low, so we may be able to take care of that in the anti-aliasing settings, or I can try increasing the probabilistic light slider a little bit more to see if we can get a better result with a still faster render time. So let's try that next. So let's try increasing the probabilistic value to 12. And there we go. And now we'll render this again. And so this is where it gets really interesting, because we've actually generated less noise, and the render time also went down. You'll notice we were at 19.9 seconds now, and we got a little bit of a cleaner image. It's kind of hard to explain why that would happen, but my guess is that because we're actually still having some of the lights in there, the anti-aliasing is not hitting that maximum rate as hard, and so we're actually in introducing less noise, we're actually able to get a slightly faster render. So this is, this method that I'm using and kind of showing in this is exactly how I would utilize this tool, because these numbers, if I set it to 12 for this scene, and that's where I land at and I'm happy with, that's not going to be the same for your own scene. So we can even try, because I have 100 lights in the scene, I could even try going up to, say, 20, and we can see what that does to our render time next. We'll hit render, and see our render time is still actually going down, and our scene is getting cleaner. So really cool. We're down to 17 seconds, so we're actually saving a huge amount of render time. And, I'm not sure exactly where we're going to net out with it, but it's definitely a really nice addition. There's definitely been a lot of situations in production where I have scenes like this where I have a lot of small point light sources, especially with city environments and that kind of thing, where you have tons and tons of buildings and lights and cars and all of these different things all need to emit light. The ability to go in and just kind of randomly only render a select few of them is really nice. So cool. The last setting I wanted to just touch on very briefly is actually in the DMC sampler, and under the image sampler settings, we have this new min shading rate. And the minimum shading rate, if you open an old version of Vray, a scene from an old version of Vray, this is actually going to be, it should default to a value of 1. If you want your scene to render exactly how it was, if it's not set to 1, you're going to want to set it to 1. This is actually a way to force Vray to ignore some of the anti-aliasing in your scene and instead focus on and take those rays and send them to everything else in your scene, which is the GI, reflections, refraction, potentially subsurface scattering, that kind of thing. And this is another setting where I actually was doing some tests and I couldn't really get, with simple scenes like this, it wasn't that drastic of a change. But if you're rendering a scene with not a lot of small detail, you may find that you can keep your max subdiv at a certain value, and so let's maybe say keep this at 1 and 8, and start trying to increase your min shading rate by a bit, and see a comparison of what it does to your render time as you change this around. And also, when I was changing it, I got some very subtle changes in the noise, and I got slightly faster render time. So nothing extraordinary, But if you're coming from Vray 2 and you see that, that's kind of the idea of this slider. And you can see if you hold your mouse over it, it says it controls the number of rays shot for anti-aliasing versus rays for other effects. And then they go on to say it's especially useful with the progressive image sampler. So that's really it for the additional render settings updates that didn't really get covered in the rest of these, around the rest of these videos. So just wanted to touch base on them and include them at the end of this, intro video for you. So moving on, while we do have this scene open that's got so many lights inside of it, I do want to show you, we've got if we go to our Vray render settings, you go to our settings tab, under the Vray tab, there is this Vray UI, and under the Vray UI, you can add the Vray shelf to your scene. So when you click create replace, that'll just kind of reset it to make sure I've got a fresh one here for this your latest version. If you had the shelf from 2.4 in your Maya and you're just now upgrading to Vray 3, you do want to create and replace so that it updates with a couple of these new features. So the first new feature that I want to show is this button right here, and this is the Vray light lister, which can be really helpful as you're lighting. You can see in this scene I've got a whole ton of these lights here, and it does show the other lights that I've got, like my rectangular key light right here, and then I've got a couple other key lights as well. I think that it failed on these names because they're actually duplicate names, and they're grouped incorrectly. So if I said like side light 1, and then side light 2. And if I go back down to that master layer so I can actually see them, you can see I've got side light 1, side light 2, and then we can unhide my key light here. If I re-click that light lister, you can see that it's properly grabbing all those names now. So the duplicate names will kind of throw it a little bit, just so you know you can fix that as you need to. In this, you can see you have control over your subdivisions, which is pretty nice. You can change the temperature values as you want to. So if you wanted your temperature to be like 4,000 on these lights, you can do that. And it's pretty cool. A couple other features of this, you can use these little buttons right here to select your light. You can turn it off and on, which is just controlling this enabled checkbox right there. And then you also have the options for invisible, diffuse, specular, and reflection contributions or not. And then also on your rectangular lights, you have the portal checkbox, which is kind of cool. So it's really nice. And then right at the top here, you can say to only show the selected lights. So now I can just only have the light that I want, and you can hit refresh to bring up the new ones. So let's switch that back to scene now. And then if you want, there's some visibility options. So you can change it to zebra pattern so you can see the darkened light as you're going across if you like that better, or you can do lines, both. You can turn off the zebra and have only the lines. So that's really the basics of it. It's just really a utility to list all of the lights in your scene. Another one of the new features that's only accessible through the shelf here is going to be the new, this is in Vray 3.1. Actually, the light lister is Vray 3.1 also. But we do have these Vray quick settings, which is pretty interesting. So in this case, you can see that we've got studio light setup, visual effects, interior, and exterior. You can also save and manage your own presets. And you can see with my current settings, I've got my anti-aliasing qualities at 29%. My shading quality is only at 3%. If you click these settings and you say, let's go to our studio setup here, you can see that it's switching me over to brute force GI, and it's got the subdivs currently set to 8, which means no additional. So if I crank up my anti-aliasing here, you can see 100% is basically 2 minimum, 25 maximum. I'm personally, I appreciate what they're doing with these, but I do want to encourage you to really to get to know and understand the DMC as it is, the adaptive mode. The DMC sampler is extremely powerful, and relying on this and just cranking your settings to something like 2 and 25 can actually be pretty brutal in a lot of situations. So you can see now if I start increasing my GI quality, you can see this, even though they're not really in tune with one another, because this setting is not going up by intervals of 25. So my brute force GI being at a subdivision of 64 doesn't exactly make sense for my max subdiv of 25. If I really wanted that to be like 3 samples or 4 samples, I would need to lower I'd need to lower that down so that it makes a little bit more sense. That being said, when you save these settings as presets, you can pass these settings to other artists in a pipeline, and this could be a nice way to just load and control some of your presets for shows. So anyways, even though it is an option, you may find that you like it. I don't really agree with the way they're doing it. You can see having a threshold of 0.002 is really just kind of crazy to me. Even at 1 and 8, having the threshold be 0.005 to me would create much longer render times than going in and just dialing these settings yourself like we do in the adaptive DMC section of this video. So again, just to kind of discuss it, you may want to go in and kind of experiment with it yourself, but generally speaking, I think it's better to control these settings independently rather than rely on these presets. All right, for this next feature, we bounced over to the scene we used in the single object properties demonstration. I disconnected the fog so that it would render a little bit faster, but we're going to show this icon right here, which is the Vray clipper. And this is a pretty interesting way to create a cross-section in your geometry. It can be really awesome for any illustrative kind of work. What you can do with it is basically create an infinite plane that cuts across a planar field. So you can see if I create this by default, brings in this object here, and I can scale this up so you can see it a little bit better. But I can rotate it around, and maybe we'll turn it a little bit like that. And basically what I'll end up getting is a slice through this object going that way. So maybe we'll bring it down. Maybe we'll rotate it down a little bit. Might get some of those objects in the background that way, and we'll still be able to see what it's doing in the foreground here. So now I'll just turn on my IPR. And by the way, I just created this. I don't have anything selected at all, and it will start working immediately on all of the objects in my scene. So this is our render coming in. You can see that that is just going in, and it's actually creating a piece of geometry to fill in that cap, which is pretty interesting. And this is also changeable in the IPR. And you can see it actually is coming into the foreground and clipping off the foreground as well. So if I raise that up a little bit, we'll prevent that from happening. Cool, so maybe I can rotate it down. So you can see it just slices right through those objects. And really, this may be a little confusing as to when you would actually want to use this, but the main thing is really any sort of cutaway style work that you're doing. So mechanical objects, or if you modeled a robot and you also had the interior modeled out, it would be kind of nice in a portfolio to show this kind of wiping through a piece of geometry, and you could see all of the interior bits of something as well. Could be kind of cool like that. The way this works, you do also have the option to make this inclusive only, so you can just add a list set of objects to this Vray clipper you can choose to exclude objects or change it to as inclusive only so that it's only happening to certain objects if you want to, or by default just happens to all of them. The other thing is you do have a choice of the material that gets created. So that gray material there that you see, if I just hold down right click and say assign V-Ray material, which is under my favorites here, then I can just make that whatever shader I want. So in this case, green. Also, if you select the clipper and you just say use object material, it'll do its best to kind of grab, I believe the UVs are just shoved down into one corner. So it'll just grab whichever color is kind of close to it there. So you can see as I go down, it's just kind of that constant green color. And then the dirt is getting a kind of dirt color. So pretty cool. Definitely a kind of interesting tool that you can use for some very creative things in your scenes. This scene with the clipper on it was saved out to the Chapter 3 update clipper version 1 file. Next thing I want to show is the implementation of an open source thing from DreamWorks called OpenVDB. I'm going to go ahead and delete this clipper file, delete the clipper in this scene. I'm going to save this one into the V-Ray update VDB. OpenVDB, just like that. There we go. So this one is implementation of this open source library, OpenVDB, from, get that in the recording thing. So this is from DreamWorks, and this is really a way to render volumetric objects across different platforms. So it's the big thing is that it stores voxel information and also will store additional channels to that, like temperature or speed, velocity, or time, and that kind of thing. So you can see there's some free just things in there download section here that we're going to be looking at. So I've got some of these in the source files for you to play around with. So the way this is going to work is we're going to create a V-Ray volume grid, and that's going to be this button right here. So this V-Ray volume grid is going to come in with an input cache file. So we can start by loading up our scenes. I'm just going to try Smoke 2. And you can see that it should find a cache info here, which is 191 by 610 by 168. And we should get our little smoke volume here. So I did a quick render of that volume just sitting there. You can see we are definitely getting that detail in there. It's pretty awesome too. This is fully workable in V-Ray RT. So again, thinking about a larger scale project, you could have somebody working in a different package like Houdini, and they can export the OpenVDB volume information out of Houdini and get it into your scene in V-Ray for Maya, or in that case, any V-Ray software that there is. And if you look at this V-Ray volume grid, it does have the attributes for a lot of this. So you can see there's the shading right here. The OpenVDB can also be used for some other stuff as well. So if you're exporting heavy isometric surfaces for liquid kind of stuff, you can do that. So a lot of that's controlled through this render mode. You can see there's this volumetric heat haze, which will create an effect. I don't know if it's going to work on this because it's not actually that data set type, but you can create some heat distortion type refraction as the ray gets marched through the volume. You can also see there's some other stuff like controls for temperature affecting the surface channel. If you scroll down a little bit, you can see there's this color section. I've got a smaller box selected so we can kind of dial this a little bit. There's also opacity, so you can see right now the opacity type is set to simple smoke, and I can control that down here. So you can see if I crank that way up, I'll start getting a much thicker volume representation of this volume that is, and the shadow will be then heavier to match as well. You can also see that I could darken that down up here in my color to start getting some of that to feel a little, so now it's starting to feel a little bit darker, smokier, that kind of thing, which is pretty cool. You can also illuminate it a little bit if you needed to have some of that incandescence. Right now you can see that the incandescence is actually mapped to temperature, and this is where you could input a ramp or something like that if you had an actual explosion. So let's take a look at that. All right, cool. So we've got let me pull back up my Vray frame buffer. We have got a little VDB here, and this is one of the ones in the folder from the VDB site, just called Fire. And you can see that once this loads up, you can see that the temperature channel is mapped into the VDB, meaning it's available to be mapped for color. So you can see here, if we scroll down to our incandescence section, that I can map that to temperature. And now I can go in and I can control the curve of where the luminance is happening. So you can see if I lower and change these points of the curve, I can control how much smoke gets some of that versus how much fire does. You can also see there's this luminance scale right here, which comes in at a pretty high value. I usually end up taking this down a little bit. So see that I took it down too much there, so I probably need another 0. But this is all based off of the luminance values coming from the temperature. And then those get pushed through this scale right here. You can see how it's now shoving that through this temperature right here. So this incandescence color is also controlled by the incandescence luminance right here. So you can see most of the temperature is really going to be coming from this end position right here. So you can see even if I bring this red further in, you can see I'm really not even seeing any of that red yet. I'm going to have to draw a little box here. So if you really want to have some color variation through the edges of your flames, you have to understand what those temperature values are. So you may, really need some of that to come way up. See, now I'm starting to get a little bit more red going through them rather than it just being solid yellow. You can also go in, so maybe I want this to be a little bit more yellow. Maybe a little more reddish orange, whatever it may be. And then, you can move that over, maybe even have something that's a little bit more white right in the center. But because there's so much heat in this, really, this thing is, churning this really hot fire color right here. I'm really not able to get in there just with the way this VDB is. You can see I still am getting some red and orange on the edges, but really that temperature is just shoved completely in through the center. So if I went in, you'd have to maybe dial down the heat in that area, or you could start trying to play with some of these dots and see if you can start. So see, that's kind of dialing down the whole thing. So you do want that to still be brighter, and then you may just have to control this ramp a little bit differently and keep a really saturated bright color as your core, like that. So now you're seeing a little bit of fire around the edges. You're getting some of that fire kind of tracing up through it, which is pretty cool. You can see if I pulled that up a little bit, I would start getting a little bit more of that fire and red color to come through because I'm exposing some of the lower temperature areas. So see, that's kind of nice. Even if I brought that up a little bit higher, we'll start eating in a little bit more into some of those cooler areas. And now I'm actually exposing some more of that color variation in there, which is really nice. These will give off global illumination as well, which is wonderful. And you do also have some render stats with these. So something it's this volume shading is really fairly limited compared to other things like Fume Effects or Houdini. So what we usually end up doing a lot of is getting something pretty close and then turning primary visibility off on this volume so that you're only getting the shadow and the light interaction rather than going in and getting a full volume rendering inside of V-Ray. You still can with stuff like smoke, but generally it's better to render that stuff on the Houdini side and then use a deep EXR. So cool, on to the next thing here. I'm just going to save this. We'll just save it with the fire kind of loaded up here, and that'll just be OpenVDB. All right, for this next new section here, you can see we've got a stereo image pulled up, and we're using the environment from our subsurface scattering discussion, and I just have some V-Ray materials assigned to them just to speed up our render time. So the first thing I want to show you is the way we turn on the stereo camera. And if we go to our shot cam here, and we'll select that camera, I've gone to Attributes, V-Ray, Stereo Camera, and essentially I've turned it on, and that's it. We have this new Adjust Resolution checkbox. And what that does is it will automatically scale your horizontal resolution to be double what it is, so that you can have two images side by side when you render. That's actually not on by default. I just turned that on. You have your interocular distance right here, your distance between your eyes. Right now, with this being set to 6.5, that's in real world scale, and this scene is pretty small. So what you'll actually see, if I bring back up that V-Ray frame buffer, this is a button we haven't used yet, but you can turn on your stereo red and blue. You can actually see these objects are pretty far apart. If I was to put on some red and blue glasses, I could actually see a little bit of depth in that to figure out. And I'm pretty sure that what I would find is that the camera was too close to these objects given that eye distance, so my eyes would feel kind of crossed because they're so close. You can see if I was to lower this, maybe say 0.65, and now I'll just re-render this. And notice how, unfortunately, the stereo setup is not working with IPR or with V-Ray RT yet. So I am actually using the regular render button. So we're waiting for our rating snaps to come in, and you can see if I turn that off, I can actually see the buckets across both eyes coming in. And if I turn that stereo back on, you can see that the distance for these objects is a little bit more manageable now, because I am kind of functioning at 1/10 scale rather than real world scale. Another added bit of functionality into our stereo workflow now is really kind of prepping for the revolution of VR and virtual reality across the world. Depending on when you're watching this video, there may already be tons of VR content available. But if you go to your render settings, we've always been able to render a spherical camera in the past. And now we're able to actually render the spherical camera in combination with the right and left eye stereo camera that V-Ray kicks out. So I can create that. I can just say, set this to spherical mode. And then right here, I can change this override FOV to be, for example, like 180 degrees or a full 360 degrees. And now if I render that out, you can see that that little tiny area is where that set actually falls in the grand scheme, the full 360 degrees of this world. You can see this a little bit clearer if I took my camera here, and let's actually bring it closer. Let's bring that camera group. Let's just set it right in the middle of our world. Maybe we can pull these back a little bit. We can bring this forward a bit, and you'll actually see, oops, select that camera group. So you can see our camera is actually right, we'll set it right here. So it's really right in the middle of all of this stuff. There we go, that should be pretty interesting. And now we'll render that out again. And now you can really see how that distortion, how that, you can really feel that 360 degree view. And so this being stereo now, I would be able to load this image into a lot of popular Oculus viewers, and I would be able to see the stereo quality of this. You can see, there we go. I would be able to load this into a 360 degree Oculus movie player, and it would work great. It's definitely a really major thing because you could render out whole environments this way. and do Oculus. You could bake down textures and do all kinds of stuff and render them out really quickly. So really awesome new stuff available for the stereo cameras inside of V-Ray. It's funny, even I've done a fair amount of stereo work now, and even just the ability to render the right and left eye together rather than doing separate images is a really nice thing data management wise, because you have access to both eyes in one image. And then in comp, you can still do your split, but just rendering wise, rendering one single image is much more manageable, much more easier to manage than having two sets of all passes. So if your pipeline already calls for two images and two cameras, you can always just leave that off and you'll still get separate images. So, but yeah, that's about it with the stereoscopic cameras. So moving on. For the next part of this new features section, I really wanted to just kind of touch on, I'm actually unpausing the video while I'm watching a render kind of come in here. This is the scene file that we were working on for V-Ray proxies, and just demonstrating the ability of loading in a whole lot of V-Ray proxies into your scene. V-Ray Chaos Group did a lot of work speeding up the V-Ray proxies in version 3, and it's definitely noticeable. Giving the ability where you can just go in and paint these V-Ray mesh proxies all over the place, and they obey Maya instances is really awesome. And they load up significantly faster, and they render significantly faster. The largest change to these V-Ray proxies, though, is really the implementation of the Alembic format into this V-Ray proxy. All the major packages have Alembic plugins now, and I really can't stress how important it is to be able to go in and just load in a Alembic file. So if you remember our scene file here, wherever it is, my file, there we go. If we open up our proxy ABC sphere scene, just having here it is. So going in a scene file like this and just really viewing this and seeing the V-Ray mesh and the Alembic, and being able to go in, see the mesh visibilities and everything, it's pretty amazing. And it's actually fairly unique to V-Ray at the moment, but being able to go in, at the moment of this video, things could always, of course, very rapidly change. But the addition of Alembic into these V-Ray proxies also brings to the table rendering particles from Alembic, and also hair splines inside of Alembic. So again, if your hair pipeline is doing a proprietary export, and you're able to get any of those hair instances from, say, a package like Houdini or 3D Studio into an Alembic package, you can render that in any V-Ray software at all. So we got a render coming in here, and again, I'm just kind of showcasing some of these new features here. So what you're looking at is actually a V-Ray proxy that's millions of polygons with subsurface scattering and refraction all being rendered inside of V-Ray RT. And to add to that, I've done a very crude V-Ray for hair setup. And if we go to our V-Ray RT engine tab in our render settings, we can turn on hair, and we can actually render V-Ray fur inside of V-Ray RT now, and it's quite fast. So if I stop this, and actually I can also go in and create some render elements here. So I can, actually I already have some created, so I'll just enable those. And I'll turn on a subsurface scattering as well. And I'll go ahead and start up my render. IPR. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button. I turned on hair paint effects. I actually need to turn on fur to get that fur to send over to our V-Ray RT engine. So I'm going to stop this render, and we will redo our IPR. But just to clear this up, so we've got hair paint effects, which is going to be the paint effects hair that you may be using, or the Maya N hair. All of that's now supported by V-Ray. And you also have your V-Ray fur, which is what I created here, going to create V-Ray fur and applying that V-Ray fur to my object. And so now when we redo our IPR, you can see our default settings are pretty terrible. Everything's really, really thick. So I can go in here and dial these settings on our V-Ray fur interactively with the IPR. And so just going in and setting my thickness maybe down to 0.01. So that's going to come in. It's looking a little bit better. And I might have a little too many hairs, I'm not sure. But anyways, just the fact we're able to get in there and even have this is definitely a step forward for V-Ray, so it's pretty awesome. So maybe if I went down to 10 hairs per face, I can go in and interactively tune this. And so that's a new thing. So also being able to see all of our passes inside of V-Ray RT, sorry, not sample rate, but refraction, reflection, specular, all of this stuff are all new features. So very awesome, very cool stuff. So cool, that's kind of the end of the video. It's definitely a challenge to hit every single piece of such a massive piece of software, but hopefully this intro video is enough to get you off the ground running and on making some really awesome stuff. So definitely take advantage of the scene files that I'm giving out this time, and hopefully everything turns out great. So thank you for watching.